So, the third meaning of holiness speaks to the rules of belonging to the holy. He is holy in his very essence. He is divinity in its truest sense. He is the creative energy of the world, but with mind and purpose, a God of love and communion. He wants community. He wants association. He likes to work through his instruments. He likes to work in cooperation, and he's made the world. He gives us a special part in that world to belong to him, to be filled with his Holy Spirit, and so we are holy to him. When the holy reveals itself, then you have the second one, the derived holiness, and that means that you belong to the holy. You are not holy in your essence, you are holy in your calling, commitment to the holy. Then, because you are holy in your calling, there are certain rules. You have to be very careful when you're dealing with the holy. The holy is dangerous. Like fire is dangerous. Like the sun is dangerous. Do you remember what was one of the big searches on Google? One of the top searches on Google after the last eclipse? Why do my eyes hurt?
That's funny.
Right? So you can't... so they have this story of this pagan is arguing with this rabbi. And he said, I don't know how you call you people are atheists. You don't have a God. He goes, I have a God. Yeah, well, you can't see your God. Well, what good is a God you can't see? He goes, you can see my God. Really? Well, show me your God. He goes, all right, I will show you my God. You want to look on my God? I'm going to let you look on my God. But before you look on my God, I need you to do something for me. I need you to hold your eyes open and stare into the sun for 1 full minute. Mm-hmm. Pagan goes, I can't stare into the sun for a full minute. I'll go blind. And he says, what? You cannot behold his creation for a minute and you wish to look upon his face? Mm-hmm. This is the very essence of it. Mm-hmm. Holiness is unbearable. Even the angelic hosts who stand before him cover their face, shield themselves from the awesomeness of it all, the glory of it all, the majesty of it all. I can't bear it. And so now, if you are going to belong to that kind of a thing, there are certain rules you're going to have to follow. And we're going to come back to this. How does a sinful people come to dwell in the presence of a holy God without being consumed? Our God is a consuming fire, is what the Hebrews is going to say. Our God is a consuming fire. It is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the Lord, because he is a consuming fire. So how do I, as a sinful person, have any hope for salvation if I cannot even stand in his presence? Because he is making a way. He's making a path. And so there's going to be a place in which I have to follow certain rules for dealing with the holy. There's certain things you just don't do. And it always is going to come around to the idea of respect. So let's look at this. Number 3, the third meaning of holiness speaks to the rules of belonging to the holy. This is where morality and ethics comes in. You have certain obligations. As being holy to the holy, you have certain obligations in your behavior and your actions, in the way that you engage the holy, and in the way you live your life. So we'll call this practical holiness. All right? So practical holiness concerns the principles and practices involved in fulfilling holiness's call. Encounters with the holy demand awesome reverence and extreme care. It's a dangerous affair. Do you remember the scene in the book of Esther where Mordecai is trying to get Esther to entreat on the behalf of the people of Israel with the king, with the Persian king? And she's like, I can't enter into his presence. If you enter unbidden into the presence of the Persian king, the guards will cut you down unless he stops them. The rule is cut them down. The exception is allow them to live. And he said, do you think that you'll be spared because you're in the house? You think you're going to be spared? You will not be spared. But it just may be that you were brought here for just such a time as this. So she risks her very life, and she marches into the presence of the king, and he extends his scepter to her. This is that kind of a dangerous encounter. It is dangerous. So with Korah and Moses, Korah is challenging the authority of Moses. By the way, he's challenging the authority of Moses because he's just been given tassels. Tassels are worn by kings and priests. They are a symbol of the priesthood of the nation. They are a holy nation, and so every man wears a symbol of priesthood upon their garments. And having received the symbol of priesthood, Korah and his guys get a little uppity. Well, look what we have. Who does this Moses fellow think he is, lifting himself up over us? We are all holy to the Lord. Why does he say we're all holy to the Lord? Because that's what the tassel means. And so Moses is like, all right, let's march into the presence of God with incense. This is a dangerous affair. And they march in the presence of the Lord, each burning incense before the Lord. And God strikes out at Korah, burns them with fire, opens the earth up and swallows them whole, destroys them. That is what could happen. She walks into the presence of the king, and he extends the scepter. She is spared. God has permitted it. Everything you do carefully. You do understanding the danger that you're in. The holy must be approached on its terms. To trifle with the holy is doom to man. You don't trifle with the holy. Everything is respect, respect, respect. Everything is, how do you want this to be done? How can I come near you? Show me what I need to do. Show me if there's any hope that I have for dwelling in the presence of my Creator without being consumed. So this concept of dwelling in the presence of consuming fire without being consumed is the very essence of the burning bush. It's a bush that doesn't burn. There's lots of fires that burst out in those kinds of dry regions. When I was a kid, in the high summers, and with lightning strikes, we'd have flash fires just in the grass. Right outside my workplace, a whole field burned up from a lightning strike in the late summer. So you have these kinds of fires, but they don't last long. Because whatever's there to be consumed is consumed, and then the fire is gone. But here, this bush just keeps on burning. So the lampstand is the very visual of a burning bush or burning tree. It's technically, I believe, it's an olive tree. And that would be for a whole other thing. We'll do the lampstand someday. That's one of my 101. It's the way people think about the lampstand, what it means. Anyway, it's a burning tree. But with it never being consumed. So to dwell in the presence of consuming fire without being consumed, like we said, this is a type of ordeal image. Did we do ordeal? We did not. We will do ordeal. Okay, it's an ordeal image. So to be thrown into the waters and not drowned, to be thrown into fires and not be burned, to be tossed to the lions and not be eaten, to walk through the waters and not drown. These are images of ordeal, that you are snatched from the maw of death by a God who embraces you and accepts you and makes you his own. Right? Jonah gets thrown off the boat, but God brings him home alive. I mean, when you're tossed in the middle of the Mediterranean is not as big as the Atlantic Ocean, but it doesn't matter. If you're thrown in the middle of the Mediterranean, the chances of you coming out alive are pretty slim if they just leave you there. And so you're thrown into the mouth of death. And so to enter into the presence of the holy is to throw yourself into the maw of death and to be accepted by God because you've approached him on his terms, because you've been found acceptable, even if it's because he fashioned the means by which you could be found acceptable. That is still an ordeal image. So they march in the presence. So you don't trifle with the holy. You're careful. You're respectful. And now what happens when you're not? Nadab and Abihu. Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 to 3. It appears, based on the structure of the story, that they get drunk. And they go back to the altar to serve before the Lord, to offer incense before him, and that they offer strange incense. In other words, he has told them exactly what incense to bring. So it's almost like they went home for lunch, had a few too many, and decided, well, you know, it would be really funny. Let's offer tang on the altar. That would be a stitch riot. You all right?
No, my legs are cold.
Oh, all right. That would be a stitch riot. We'll put tang on the altar. And so they do. They offer this strange incense because they're drunk. And God pours out holy fire from the Holy of Holies and burns them alive where they stand. You don't mess with the holy. You have the Egyptian who remember, they came out of Egypt as a mixed multitude, and it's the first great Sabbath, and they're told that they need to consecrate the Sabbath. And this Egyptian, who will not be restrained, goes out, shaking his fist at heaven. No one's going to tell me when I can work and when I can't work. And he goes out to collect firewood. He's caught, and they stone him. Okay? Korah, we've already talked about Korah and his comrades. Now we have another situation where it's in the book, it's right on the heels of Korah. So whether or not it actually happened time-wise on the heels is not necessarily so. But the story is told together, where the other priests begin to challenge, why does Aaron get to be the high priest? Why don't we get to be high priests? Why are we given a lower position? We're just as good as he is. You know, our sons didn't get burned up, you know. And that kind of, who does he think he is? Hoity-toity. His boys got consumed by the Lord. And so what they do is they take their staffs and they put them in the presence of the ark overnight. And Aaron's staff blooms to life. It is made alive, and their staffs are not. They are dead. They are rejected. That which is made alive is embraced. That which is crushed and destroyed is rejected. All right. So we have the same thing. Saul marches in to do a sacrifice instead of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 8 to 14. They want to go to battle. They want a sacrifice to the Lord to get the Lord's approval for the battle. But Samuel keeps delaying. Saul's getting nervous. People are going to start thinking bad things. So he goes and offers a sacrifice himself. And this is not his job. It's not his place. Now we have Uzzah, who's one of the Levites, and they're supposed to carry the ark on their shoulders with these certain types of staffs. But instead, at the command of David, they put it on an ox cart. And while they're pulling with the ox cart, the oxen stumble, and the ark goes to slide off the cart. Uzzah reaches out and grabs it to keep it from falling off the ark. Now there's one rule as a Levite. Never touch the ark.
Kapow.
Yeah. Pow. He's dead. Yeah. All right. So R.C. Sproul talks about Uzzah, and he makes this really great comment. He goes, Uzzah's mistake was thinking that if the ark fell into the mud, that the mud was more defiling than his hands. He goes, the mud never does anything but obey God. It's dirt when it's dry and mud when it's wet. It works in perfect obedience to the Lord. Uzzah, however, is a sinful man, and he puts his sinful hands on the Ark of the Covenant, and God pays him back for it. I had a pastor friend of mine who kept getting up to preach and realizing that nobody was cleaning the pulpit. And so he would go and ask the woman who cleaned the church, hey, I really need you to get some attention to the pulpit. Next week he gets up, it's still even dustier. She's fairly new on the crew. So he goes to her again, look, I know I asked you last week to do it, and you didn't do it. Please, I really need you this week to clean it up. It's really unseemly up there. He gets up the next week, it's dusty again. He finally goes, why won't you clean the pulpit? And she doesn't speak a lot of English, so she opens up to the story of the Bible of Uzzah touching the ark. She was afraid to touch the podium.
Oh, wow.
Anyway. So we have Uzziah, the king, who gets up hoity-toity in 2 Chronicles 26:16-21 and marches into the temple of the Lord, and the Lord strikes him with leprosy. Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, 1-11, they lie to the Holy Spirit. They fake the generosity before the church. Now we have Herod Antipas in Acts chapter 12. He allows the people to worship him as a god, and God strikes him with worms. Right. Now, Hebrews 10:19 and following. Having therefore, brethren, boldness to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by the way which he dedicated for us, a new and living way, through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. This is the concept. It is a dangerous thing to enter into the presence of the holy, but Jesus Christ has gone before us, and we're with him. He's righteous. He's acceptable. He's been resurrected from the dead. God has accepted his offering, his sacrifice, and it's like he stands there and says, you want me? You're there with me. We, by faith, enter in boldly before the Lord, even though to enter boldly before the Lord is fool's errand. But now we can enter boldly before the Lord because we have the perfect covering that is Jesus Christ. We want to associate that a little bit, this idea of, so one of the big questions I used to ask when I was younger is, why does the cross work? How does Jesus' death on a cross and his resurrection have anything to do with my sin and why I'm acceptable? It didn't make sense to me. I'm not saying I didn't believe it, I just didn't understand it, and I wanted to understand it. So I used to be told, when I would ask this in Sunday school, shut up, you're rebellious. So I'm not rebellious. I'm not telling you I don't believe it. I'm telling you I don't understand it. How does it work? There's an answer here. I know there's an answer here. I have a big thing, always trying to figure out the rules of everything. What are the rules of how we do things around here? What's the right processes that I'm supposed to use here? And I was always frustrated if I didn't know the rules. And so here again, it was a mystery to me. And never got a great answer. And I'm sitting there one day in New York City, witnessing to people on the street, and I'm talking to this prostitute, trying to preach the gospel to her, and she says, what in the world does Jesus' death on a cross have anything to do with my sin? If you can't answer me that, maybe I'll believe. And I'm sitting there going, I'm looking at her like, I know, right? I know. I'm going to ask you the same question. I don't know. I don't know why it works. It just works. And she just blows me off. I go up into we were staying at a university there, and I went into my dorm room, and I got up on my bunk, and I wept. Lord, I need to understand the cross. I need to understand why it works. And there's an element that I was always missing, and I think it's an element that most modern Westerners are missing. It's the element of corporate personality. The idea of being part of of a corporate, being part of a group. We are part of a corporate. We are sons of Adam. We're daughters of Eve, all of us. And that corporate identity is doomed. The only hope for us is to become part of another corporate entity, is to find safety and protection in one that's not doomed, one that is acceptable. So, for instance, the Israelites are going to tear into Jericho, and I think we've talked about this in the other lessons, but they come in, and this prostitute who believes in the Lord, who believes that he's going to destroy the Jericho people, who believes that her people are doomed, and probably that they deserve it. And so she helps them, helps the spies escape the leaders of Jericho. And she asks something of them. She asks for protection. And so they tell her, give her a scarlet cord, and they make a covenant over this scarlet cord. Anybody in your house will be spared. Literally, your house will be a little piece of Israel. Now, what do you think she did? Now, we're not told that she went around telling everybody, but we can only know what would you do.
I pack it full.
You pack that thing full. Everybody lay down here. I think we can get them 10 deep.
Yeah.
Get in here, you'll live. Get in here, you'll be safe. But it requires that you trust the Lord. You trust God. You trust the people of Israel. You trust that that is a true God and that only He can save you. And you put all of your hope and all of your everything under the procedure that He's given you for being saved from Him. And then everybody that's in that room is saved because of her. She has joined a new corporate identity. And everybody that comes into her house is saved because of her act. This is what happens with the cross. So Noah, we come and we say, the whole earth was full of violence and wickedness and sinfulness, and it got to the point where there was only one righteous man left on the earth. It did not say only 8 righteous people left on the earth. It said one righteous man left on the earth, Noah. And yet his sons and his wife and his sons' wives are on that ark because they belong to him. Noah's like, you want me? You get them because they're with me. Then we come to the scene after the incident with the golden calf. And I believe that God is testing Moses. And God does this a lot. He says things to us to test us, to put us through the paces, to make us a partner in what He's doing. And He says to Moses, all right, Moses, I've had enough of these people. Get out of my way. I'm going to burn them up. I'm going to pour out my holy fire, and they're going to be consumed. But I will rebuild a nation out of you. Just like I built a nation out of Abraham, I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to wipe everybody out except you. And I'm going to fulfill my promise to Abraham through you. And I'm going to make a new nation through you. And Moses won't move. Moses is like, no. If you're going to blot them out, blot me out with them. If you want me, you get them. Because they're with me. As sinful and terrible and horrible, they're rotten. I get it, God. They're terrible. I want to beat them myself. But if you want me, you get them. Because they're with me. It's that idea of the corporate covering, corporate headship. So here, we are all sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. And as our being part of that association, we are doomed. But Christ is accepted. He is proven accepted. His sacrifice, His offer on behalf of all of us. He's starting a new family, a new people. And if we're in Him, we're in His house, just like they're in Rahab's house. We're on His ark, just like Noah's family was on his ark. We're part of those terrible, rotten, no good people of Israel that are covered by Moses, who is acceptable. We're in His house. We're in Jesus' house, and He's acceptable, and He can stand before the Lord. He's made the sacrifice. He's made atonement, and everybody that believes in Him and joins His house finds acceptance before the Lord, and we can enter boldly into His presence.
And the veil was split.
Yeah, that's a great imagery, the tearing of the veil.
Yeah.
That separation of the Holy of Holies from the holy place. Just ripped open, and we go walking on in. All right, but you approach the holy very carefully. Hebrews 10:19. So we've already read this. So you can enter with boldness through Christ. All right, so there are 4 principles to remember. I am not simply going to talk about the idea of holiness as personal character and morality here. I want to lay down some rules for the rules of holiness so that you understand what's happening from Genesis to Revelation. Why does the book of Leviticus say what it says? Why does the book of Exodus say what it says? Not just who are we in Jesus, but let's really understand why the high priest could not marry anybody they wanted. Let's understand why you couldn't have a bathroom on the temple precinct. Right? Why you weren't allowed to be naked on the temple precinct. Right? Why you weren't. All right. So let's read it. So 4 principles to remember when considering the rules of holiness in the Bible. Principle 1. You will resemble what you reverence. You will look like your God for good or ill. This is really important. This is formative stuff. This is worldview stuff. Whatever you believe God to be, in your worship of that God, you will imitate him. Now, the pagans imitate their gods. They imitate their gods through oppression. They imitate their gods through hierarchies. They imitate their gods through their vile sexuality, through their murder, child sacrifices. So if you worship the god Molech, and Molech demands your firstborn child, if you worship pagan gods that say that they will only bless your house if you kill one of your children, stuff it in a jar, and bury it under the corner post of your house, if that's the kind of God you worship, what kind of a person are you? You're going to imitate them. The gods don't value human beings, and so you don't value human beings. The gods oppress, rape, murder, destroy. So you rape, murder, destroy. You will imitate your God for good or for ill. All right? You'll resemble what you worship. You will look like your God. So this is one of the big things that happens in Scripture, where when you hear the phrase, they have eyes that can't see and ears that can't hear, that's the description of an idol. Mm-hmm. They have feet that can't walk, hands that can't touch. And so when the people are described as having eyes that can't see and ears that can't hear, they're describing them as becoming like their gods. They're becoming like the idols. They have the sick morality, the diseased socialization of these things. So this is a very important idea. Principle 2, Yahweh's revealed attributes and character establish all the practical, symbolic, moral, and ethical requirements in worshiping him. You are literally to imitate him, to reflect him. You're supposed to resemble him, to become more and more like him, to reflect him back to him, to become like him because you see him for what he is. That's going to become very important. So in this sense, there is no thing called moral law that God has to match. He is the moral law. Who he is, his character, his values, what he wants, what he reveals himself as. And we're going to put a few of these. So we were even talking in the writing of this book we're doing on Meditations on God, we were talking about whether or not the essence attributes have moral implications. Because we're just talking about the nature of God as God. So what could the essence attributes say to us morally? And we started. It was a very interesting conversation because we started saying, "Well, God is omnipresent, so you should be present." Mm. And then we started saying stuff like this: "Well, God is eternal, so you should be eternity minded." God is, you know what I mean? So how are we not present? We are frequently not present, especially when we try to obliterate our senses. We try and distract ourselves with endless entertainments. We drink booze and we take drugs and we try and get out of our own. We can't stand the feeling of being in our own skin. We are not present. We have a family, but we don't pay attention to them. We get lost inside our own selfish minds instead of paying attention to our kids or paying attention to our spouses or building our home. We're just not present. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting because it was obvious how the moral attributes of God are reflected morally in us. He is gracious, we should be gracious. He is just, we must have justice. Our graciousness should not eradicate justice. We should not sit there and say, well, whatever. God just forgives everything, so we shouldn't hold anybody accountable. Oh, Hitler, you little rascal, you. No, we must hold people accountable. We must hold sinners accountable for their sin. And yet, always remember, God is merciful. So we want to reflect him back to him. So he is the moral standard. What he reveals about himself. All right, so principle 3. The nearer your association with the revealed holy, the greater the restriction in one's actions before the holy. We call this graded sanctity. So the high priest who entered once a year into the Holy of Holies has a very strict what he can and what he can't do. So he is never allowed. If his parents die, he cannot touch their bodies. Ever. So whereas the normal priest can go to the funeral, kiss his dead parents, put them in their tombs, and then go through a ritual cleansing of washing death off of himself before he walks back into holy space, the high priest is never permitted to touch the dead at all. He is not allowed to marry a widow or even a woman that's had sexual relations before. Why? Because God hates people that have had sexual relations? No, but it preaches. It preaches about the nature of life before the holy, about what the true standards of righteousness are. There is mercy and there is grace, but in holy space, very, very careful. So the fourth principle, holy does not necessarily mean good, profane does not necessarily mean bad. Now, when we get to moral categories, these will be issues of good and bad, but the issues of clean and unclean, ready to engage the holy, not ready to engage the holy, is fit to be preached about the holy, unfit to be preached about the holy, as far as our behavior and ritual. These are not necessarily issues of good and bad. So you're not allowed to bring sexuality of any kind and associate it with the temple worship of the Lord. Bring it into the place of the holy. That's the stuff of this realm, and this realm is the profane. Profane does not mean wicked. It just means of this world. And holy means of that world. Holy is of the stuff associated with God. And what we don't associate with the worship of God is sex. Because that is what the whole world is polluted with. A worship that demands sexuality. In Babylon, there was a cult that required every virgin to sell her virginity as a prostitute in the house, in the temple of the goddess.
Jeez.
And you weren't allowed to get married until you gave away your virginity for money.
And that was in Egypt, right? Egypt, right?
It was in Babylon.
I know Egypt had to do it too. They had to serve 1 year in the temple, the women.
There's a certain goddess that required it. Yeah. So I'd love to see the one in Egypt. I'm familiar with the one in Babylon. But anyway, you get the idea. It's not, God does not think that sex between a husband and a wife are bad. But if a husband had sex with his wife, he has to let 24 hours pass and he has to bathe himself before entering into holy space. Why? An intentional and deliberate separation of that which is of that realm from that which is of this realm. That's part of the respect, part of the idea. All right, now, we're going to have certain functionaries in Israel. So we have the priests, and their relationship to the holy is that they preserved a separation between the holy and the profane. Sacred space, sacred time, and sacred people. That was their main concern. So, like, we can sit there and say, when we talk about Jesus coming among the dead, and touching the dead, and instead of contracting uncleanness from touching of the dead, imparts life to the dead. He gives them cleanness, right? The very essence of cleanness by touching them. The priest wasn't worried. The priest isn't saying that stuff's not of God. The priest is saying, I exist so that every worshiper understands the nature of engaging the holy. And so they had these rules that they made everybody follow so that we would be intentional, that we would be mindful of the holy, mindful of our responsibility to the holy, mindful that we belong to him. So the tassel was given as a symbol of priesthood so that every Israelite would be mindful. Every morning they put on the tassels. Every evening they took off the tassels. They recited scripture when they put them on. They recited scripture when they took them off. And they looked at it and said, I am a priest of God. I have obligations. So they tell the story of the Hebrew student who was in love with a local prostitute. And no matter what he did, he was so full of lust, he just couldn't conquer it. And he decided the only way that he could get past this is just to go ahead and save up his money and buy her for an evening, and then he'll get it out of his system. And so he goes to her house after he saved up enough money. She's got all these wonderful delights prepared for him. And as he goes to whip off his clothes to begin to engage with her, his tassels hit him in the eyes. When his tassels hit him in the eyes, and he's like, ow, ow, my eyes! And he suddenly looks and realizes, and he slumps to the ground, and he says to her, I have to leave. She's like, what? Nobody's ever walked out on me. What indecency have you found in me? Am I not pretty enough? He goes, no, it's not that. And he explains about the tassels as a symbol of his priesthood, of his holiness, who is God. And he goes, I'm supposed to look on them and to remember my obligations. As a holy person, I have obligations. I have to live like I'm holy. He is holy. We are holy to him. Because we are holy to him, I must live like I'm holy to him. And so I have to leave. And she ends up converting. She's so moved by this moment that she ends up getting converted and becomes a student of this man's rabbi. So the priests are very fixated on how the ritual system preaches in order to make people mindful of what it means to be sinful people seeking to dwell in the presence of a holy God. What it means to be people who are going to stand before the holy Creator unveiled at some point in their life, and they will stand before him protected and covered and acceptable, or they will stand before him as in rebellion, in rage, in unity with him and be consumed forevermore. One of the two. And they preserve the preaching. They preserve the system. That's what they're really big into. All right, so the priests fought to preserve reverence in worship and the theology of salvation through a preservation of the separation between the holy and the profane, through the preservation of things within their sphere of existence. That is not necessarily evil, but it has nothing to do with this holy space, this holy place. So the holy is the holy, the profane is the profane, and never the two shall meet. Remember, profane does not necessarily mean bad. It means not to be associated with the holy. It is of this world, this fallen, weak, sick, lost world. It's a part of us in our human existence. It's not a part of God in the eternal worship of the Holy One. So moral and non-moral issues are often mixed up. They're mixed together in priestly documents because the symbolism in the worship system of Israel declared the means by which sinful men could dwell in the presence of a holy God and live. And it required a proper reflection of Yahweh in the worshiper. It declared what things Yahweh desired to have associated with his worship and what things he did not. He preserved sacred space. It is the manifested holy presence of Yahweh which makes space holy. The nearer one comes to the manifested place of Yahweh, the more ritual restrictions are set in place. In Mosaic law, this entails outside the camp, inside the camp, the outer court, the tabernacle, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. You get closer. You're outside the camp. You're in the camp. Right? You're inside the sanctuary. You're inside the holy place. You enter into the Holy of Holies. The closer you get to that hot center, the more rules that you had. And so whenever you're reading scriptures and they're saying all these weird things, ask yourself, how is this reflecting graded sanctity? And what is this saying about the nature of what it means for we as sinful people to seek to be in relationship with a holy God? What is it telling us about that? He preserves sacred space. So all the symbols of the pollution and imperfections of this world were kept separate from holy space. So if you were a dwarf, what we call little people today, you were not permitted into sacred space. Not because God hated them, but because it preaches. The optics. Mm-hmm. The optics preached. This is not such a place. Now, in the perfect vision of the Holy One, in the end of time, the little people whose bodies are broken and torn from mixed up genetics would walk into holy place and be made pure and whole. The leper would be made clean. The dead would be made alive. Rather than defiling it, it would impart life and holiness to them. So contact between the holy and the profane has a polluting effect on the holy. Not true holiness, but holy things. Because remember, I can't take my bowl, offer it to the Lord, and bring it home and eat my Lucky Charms in it. If I did bring it home and eat my Lucky Charms in it, I have defiled it. I cannot then take it in this defiled condition and come back and offer incense to the Lord. It would be an insult, a sacrilege to the Lord. And man, would you consider a person who shows up to a wedding in torn shorts, a wife-beater t-shirt, their hair mussed up, grease all over their face, dirt all over their hairs, crusted under their fingernails, and showed up and sat in the front row of a wedding? Would you consider that indecent?
Oh, definitely.
Disrespectful.
It would be generally considered very disrespectful. Mm-hmm. Somebody might even do it accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they don't know, but it's still going to be received as disrespectful. So it's the same thing. All right, so uncleanness is removed in much the same way. The uncleanness is removed through two main ways, and that is washing and the passage of time. Time passes, and you do a washing. The priest preserves the reverence of special times. This is so the priest preserves sacred time. So the priest preserves the reverence of special times associated with Israel's relationship with Yahweh. It's this moment in time. This time is dedicated. That's what we mean by holidays. It's a holy day. It's a day that we set aside. This is our day for reflecting on the things of God, the things that God has done among us. We show respect for that day. We behave. So like when we can sit there and say, don't say that in church, or it's Sunday. You can't swear on a Sunday, and we might laugh and say, well, what difference does it make if you swear on Sunday and Monday? You shouldn't swear on Monday either. Well, maybe you shouldn't swear on Monday, but there is still something to be said for the person who recognizes that there's something special here. Religion and the word, they always preserve something special. What's one of the first things that happens when you get out of it and get into humanism? There's nothing special. There's nothing sacred. Nothing matters. Who cares? A wedding is not anything that you should show respect for. The union that's being made is nothing, so who cares? Big deal. So what? Well, this is not the way that you work. So the Sabbath reflects Yahweh. He rested. Israel rests. He acts on the sanctity of this day on behalf of the oppressed to provide rest for the soul. Okay? Sunday, or the Sabbath break, is not for you. It's for the people that you lean on to support your existence. It's not for the master. It's for the servant. It's not for the plower. It's for the animal. It's being used to plow. There's an element of it. Yes, it's for you, but more so, it's about a recognition of a day of life-giving. It's a blessed day. It's a day of life-giving. And so feasts and fasts celebrate historical and habitual blessings from Yahweh. All right. So on these special days, you remember mercy. You're giving thanks. You're consecrating yourself and your goods. You're remembering that everything you have belongs to the Lord. You're taking these holy days and you're dedicating the time of those days toward God and the things of God. Now, so let's talk about the prophet, because we have three main functionaries and then a fourth that we're going to talk about. So the priest, he's worried about the sanctuary and making sure that the entire ritual system of worship preaches the right things about God, and that you have a mindfulness about dealing with the holy. That the holy is always special and sacred and is approached carefully with reverence. The prophet is a little different. The prophet works as a covenant ambassador. He's trying to build societies that reflect the character, will, and purpose of holy Yahweh. We serve a holy God. He is a just God, so we must be just. He is a merciful God, so we must have mercy. So this is the thing. You will resemble what you worship. We worship Yahweh in this place here, not the sanctuary. That's got its own stuff going on. But right here, our holiness is manifested in that we look like God. We are transformed into his image. We study who he is so we know what we should be. All good things fall from his hand. Therefore, we should be generous. God loves everyone and especially redeems the broken things. We should be seeking to redeem broken things. He is merciful. We should be merciful. He is righteous. We should be righteous. He punishes sin. We should punish sin and remember mercy. So this is that social thing in this society. Justice. We must never get confused with this in social justice. Social justice is not biblical justice. Social justice involves equal outcome, and biblical justice involves your identity as image bearer of God. That every human being, no matter rich or poor, of every nation, of every tongue, of every age, and that includes whether you're 2 cells tall or 99 and ready to fall into dust, you are an image bearer of God and deserve to be treated with all the respect that that position demands. Because to strike at the image of God is to strike at God himself. To strike at that unborn child is to strike at the image of God. To strike at the poor man on the street because he is a poor man and can't do anything to you is to strike at God. All right. So holiness calls and commissions. It obligates the Israelite to a reflection of the will and character of Yahweh in society. We must become like our God. Intentionally so. That means we have to study him and think about him and look at everything that he's done and say, what does this thing that he is, how is that rightly reflected in my life? Well, this is one of the big things is tithes. All good things fall to me from his hand. I honor that by giving back 10%. It's like if I gave you a $10 bill and I said you can have $9. If you went out and spent the whole $10, you stole $1 from me. Because I gave you 10, said you can have 9, but you need to give 1 back to me. That's what tithes is. In recognition, as an act of worship, when you do something specifically because of who God is, and you are seeking to reflect who God is in your behavior, then that is an act of worship. In work of transforming yourself. So encounters with Yahweh demands moral and ethical cleanness to be in sync with the character, plans, and purposes of Yahweh. This cleanness is moral and ethical. The leaders of Israel get into trouble when they fail to work righteousness in society, when they fail to care for the weak, the poor, the oppressed, and fail to punish the wicked as Yahweh does. There is no love of God in overlooking the crimes of man against man. None. We all saw this woman who was just released in New York City. She stabbed a man went to jail. They let her out without bail. She got on a train. She went to Philadelphia. She stabbed a woman, walked around a corner, and stabbed a baby in a stroller.
Nice.
Jesus.
The people that had her in their power and let her go are wicked, and they have done great evil. There's no mercy on, let's be merciful and not hold her accountable for her actions, so that her evil spreads, so that her mayhem pollutes the rest of society. The prophet says this is not a proper reflection of the holy. Now, holiness means complementing the attributes of Yahweh in society. Yahweh is glorious. We should be noble. Man, this whole idea, one of the things that they're working on our society, we are ignoble. We don't dress up for church. We don't dress up for weddings. We don't consider anything special. We don't consider any place special. We go to Walmart in our pajamas.
I know.
Now, back in the 70s, my mother used to go to the grocery store with her hair in curlers because that night she was going to put on the dog and be going out with my dad. And so we'd be growing. And you know what? We would have been embarrassed, except half the women in the grocery store had their hair in curlers. But still, there's an element, like back in the 50s, if you were going to go over to somebody's house, you had a suit and tie.
Oh, yeah.
You went around in a suit and tie. You showed respect for other people by the way you dressed, the way you acted. This intentionality. He is glorious. We should not be slovenly. We should not be dirty. Right? We should not be destructive. We should not live in squalor. Our places should be clean. We should care if our place smells. We should care if we smell. You know, these things. We should care about these things. It's a conscious attempt to reflect Him back to Him, instead of being sloppy and indifferent and disrespectful to people that are around us. Yahweh is sovereign over all, right? So the people should be just and righteous. Yahweh is omniscient God of counsel. People should trust Him alone and stay away from pagan allies. Right? I don't go making covenants with pagans because I trust God, because He's sovereign. And it's not that foreign king I have to worry about. It's the King of all kings that I have to worry about. So this is a reflection of His. Yahweh is omnipotent. The people should fear Him alone. All right, the last person that we're talking about is this idea of the sage. He promotes the fear of Yahweh, demonstrated in a lifestyle befitting those who claim to walk before an all-seeing God. He's keenly interested in the day-to-day events, thoughts, and attitudes of those who represent Him. So for the sage, he's asking you to get your... So the priest says, get your worship right. The prophet says, get your society right. The sage says, get your private thoughts right. What you are is what you're willing to do in private when no one's looking at you, when you think you won't get caught. Now, these all get represented in the apocalyptic writers who begin to work on this thing called a whole life holiness, where in the renewed community after the exile, they're trying to get everybody back into shape so that our worship is right, our society is right, and our hearts are right as we're living before God. The fourth definition of holiness is the transformed state promised in the unveiled presence of God. So the fourth definition of holiness is the transformed state promised in His unveiled presence. 1 John 3:2. We do not yet know what we shall be, but we know that we shall be like Him, for we will see Him as He is. And in the prophets, they anticipate this idea that while the priests are maintaining and protecting holy space and holy people and from defilement, because they're working on the ritual system and what the ritual system preaches, there's a recognition that when God shows up in the fullness of who He is, it transforms us. And they talked about that in the video that we watched from the Bible Project. It's outstanding, outstanding. That hot coal that is touched to the lips of Isaiah, Jesus who touches the dead man, is that by seeing God for who He is and being protected, being part of the family that can be there, being able to walk boldly into His presence because of the shed blood of Christ, because we're protected and covered in Christ, there's a transformation that takes place. So this begins with the acceptance of God. When we wake up to Him and we give ourselves to Him, that's the beginning of it. We begin to attune our lives to Him, to begin to change our thoughts, change our actions, change our culture, change everything about ourselves to become more and more like Him. This process of what we call sanctification. That's the holiness. That word sanctification is the holiness of number 4. It's the beginning by which we are being transformed and changed to be like Him in the world. And that process will be completed. I call this eschatological holiness because it will be completed when we stand before Him and see Him in His unveiled presence. His unveiled presence is going to destroy us or glorify us. We're not going to become gods, but we're going to become like the angels of heaven. We're going to get resurrected bodies. We're going to be made incorruptible to reflect him perfectly. Eschatological holiness. All right. So the day is coming with every man and woman, every child, every person on this earth is going to stand before holy God unveiled. That's the eschatological promise. We were made from him, we were made by him, and we will return to him. And it's a promise of judgment, and it's a promise of glorification. Every sin will be dealt with. Every wicked man who resists him till their blind death will stand before him and answer for what they've done. His holiness is punitive, but his holiness is also purgative for those who love him and are protected by him. God is a consuming fire, and it burns up whatever's out of sync with him. And all men will pass through the fires of judgment. The Jews must have this vision of us passing through a river of fire that is God's unveiled holiness, the fire of God. And we will either be consumed by it forevermore, or we will be made pure, be made a perfect reflection of his likeness through it. And then that's what we get down to.